Hello everybody, my name is Iman and I'm your virtual tutor today as we go through the Intro to Biochemistry. In this lesson, students will work to build an understanding of biochemistry and the dual element of the topic. They will do practice problems pertaining to the topic and develop an introductory understanding. The target grade is 3rd to 6th grade, however, the lesson can be modified as needed. Alright, so let's start with what is biochemistry. Biochemistry is the study of chemistry of living things. Biochemists work to identify the thousands of different chemical compounds and the processes that occur in living things. They seek to understand the roles these play in developing and sustaining life. On the left, you can see some students working in a laboratory. So let's go into more about the depth of what exactly is a biochemist. Biochemists typically study the chemical composition of living things and of biological processes such as cell development, growth, heredity, and disease. They typically conduct research projects, manage laboratory teams, prepare technical reports, and they present research findings. Most biochemists work on research teams alongside experts in other fields such as chemistry, physics, and engineering. So when it comes to science, a lot of different fields have to come together to make conclusions. Let's go through the brief history of biochemistry and how it came to be, because before the 18th century, many scientists thought that living things do not obey the laws of chemistry. This is typically just because of the religious and the Christian beliefs of the community, and just felt that God's creatures, aka humans, did not have to abide by the laws of chemistry. However, in 1770s, a French chemist named Antoine Lavoisier showed that the process of breathing is similar to the chemical reaction that takes place when something is burned. In both cases, there is a reaction involving the chemical element oxygen. In the 1800s, scientists were able to artificially create a chemical that is usually made by living things. All of this was able to show that living things were a part of chemistry. So what about cells? Cells are another big part of biochemistry. Scientists had also begun to study the tiny structure in the body called cells. In the 19th century, they learned that cells are the most basic units of all living things and that most cells are made up of the same parts. As they studied how cells work, they found out that all cells undergo certain key chemical reactions. As a result, the studies of biology and chemistry began to overlap, and biochemistry became a new field of study. Because it isn't exactly chemistry, but it's not exactly biology, it's rather a mix of the two. Okay, so the Miller-Urey experiments recreated the atmosphere of primitive Earth with the energy sources and temperatures that have led to the spontaneous formation of amino acids and their biologically important molecules. Basically, they were able to conclude that several of key molecules of life could have been synthesized on primitive Earth. Therefore, living things obey the laws of chemistry. On the right is a photo of what they did, however, the specifics aren't that important. Okay, so where does oxygen come from, and how did eukaryotes get here? This is also a big question when it comes to biochemistry, because oxygen plays a very big role, you will see. Oxygen levels rose about 2.5 billion years ago, thought to have been created by photosynthesis by cyanobacteria living in the area. The oxygen-rich ozone layer was also established, shielding the Earth's surface from harmful solar radiation. Fossils indicate that our own species, Homo sapiens, arose in eastern Africa some 190,000 years ago, first venturing beyond Africa about 70,000 years ago. The first eukaryotes can be seen in the fossil record about 1.5 billion years ago. So let's just do a self-check. Number 1, what do biochemists do? A, they work with animals to ensure the species lives on. B, they graph and code chemical equations and information. C, they work to study the chemical makeup of living things. D, they look at chemical situations from a biological perspective. Number 2, what was the significance of the Miller-Urey experiment? A. It proved that the key molecules of life can be synthesized and function under chemistry laws. B. It proved that DNA is the genetic material of life. C. It proved that humans originated in Africa. And D. It proved that oxygen cannot be synthesized in a lab and must be natural. So the answer is C and A. So biochemists work to study the chemical makeup of living things, and the Miller-Urey experiment was able to prove that the key molecules of life can be synthesized and function under chemistry laws. Okay, so part 2, elements. Let's start with the basic part of elements, which are known as atoms. An atom is a basic unit that everything is made up of. There are many different kinds of atoms with different names, sizes, and weights. The atoms are very, very tiny. The largest one would be about 200,000. These mean times smaller than the width of a human hair. Every atom is made up of 3 kinds of smaller parts: the protons, the neutrons, and the electrons. The protons are positive, so pos, protons. Neutrons are neutral, so they have no charge. Electrons are negative. So the shape of the atom would be that the protons and the neutrons are in the middle of the atom in what is called the nucleus. They both have a weight to them, and therefore they are heavier. However, they are also surrounded by a cloud of moving electrons, which are very light, and then are, of course, attracted to the positive charge of the nucleus. As you can see here, the neutrons and the protons make up the middle of the atom, and then you have the electrons orbiting around. So when it comes to reading a element, the bottom number is the number of protons, and then on the top is the mass number, which is the number of neutrons plus protons. Okay. There are 94 naturally occurring elements in nature. Of the 94, 20 are essential to life. However, most of these elements are needed in small amounts, known as trace elements, and then are referred to as trace elements. So almost 99% of the mass of the human body is made up of only 6 elements: oxygen, carbon, hydrogen, nitrogen, calcium, and phosphorus. There are other elements such as potassium, sulfur, sodium, chlorine, and magnesium that are also found in the body, but collectively they only make up less than 1% of the human body. Okay, so the bonds to form a molecule. Because a single atom isn't able to do much, and they have to interact. The atoms have to interact to create molecules. So electronegativity is the atom's ability to attract and hold electrons, basically referring to how greedy they are. Covalent bonds is when atoms share electrons. This is done between 2 nonmetals. So we have 2 types of covalent bonds. Nonpolar covalent bonds is an equal sharing of electrons between atoms. They would have the same electronegativity, meaning that both of them, no one is greedier than the other. Then we have polar covalent bonds. This is an unequal sharing of electrons between atoms. And they would have, the atoms have different electronegativities. This creates a slight negative charge and a slight positive charge. I mean, one atom is greedier than the other, so it's going to take the electrons, meaning that it's going to get negative, because when you take electrons, you're going to get more negative. The one's going to be without some electrons, so it's going to get positive. Then we have a different type of bond, which is known as an ionic bond. This bond formed between the attraction after the complete transfer of an electron from a donor atom to the acceptor, so from a metal to a nonmetal. So covalent bonds are just between 2 nonmetals, and it's a sharing, while ionic bonds are between a metal and a nonmetal, and it's a donation, or transfer, I guess you could say. On the bottom right, you can see the 3 different types of bonds discussed and their differences and what they will look like. So the periodic table is very famous. It features a list and properties of all known and tested naturally and artificial elements. So let's take a closer look at the periodic table. Each chemical number has a particular feature called its atomic number. The number comes from the amount of protons in each atom of the element. The periodic table arranges the elements in rows and columns. So the atomic number is very important because electrons can change, neutrons can change. However, the number of protons never changes for a element. As soon as the proton number changes, it's a completely different element. So if somebody were to ask you what element has six protons, it can only ever be carbon. However, if they were to ask you which element has 6 neutrons or 6 electrons, the answer can be very ambiguous because neutrons and electrons are constantly changing. So in the rows, the elements are placed in order of the atomic number, and the columns form groups of elements that have similar chemical properties. So the organization of the periodic table is very precise and strategic. So the organization helps people when you take the first look at a periodic table, you're able to immediately learn more about each element, even if you don't know their name. Then each column is grouped with elements that have similar, chemical properties. So the first column is made up of elements alkali metals. The metalloids are eight elements from groups 13 to 16. So column 17 is made of halogens. Column 18 is made up of noble gases. So it is very important to know that. So if you look at the right, the photo is of how you would typically see a element of the periodic table. So there's the name of the element as well as the atomic number. There's also the official abbreviation for the name of the element. So you can't make up abbreviations. There's only something that's official. And there's also the atomic weight of the element. So yeah. So let's try a scavenger hunt. Make sure to refer to the periodic table in the last slides or pull up the periodic table in the tab. Number 1, which element is number 14 on the periodic table? Number 2, what is the atomic mass of carbon? Number 3, to which element group does argon belong? Number 4, which element has a symbol that starts with a letter different from its name? This question, there can be multiple answers. You'll see one example, but of course there can be more than one. Which element has the lowest atomic number? Number 6, what is the first element with an atomic mass greater than 100? Number 7, what is the heaviest alkali metal? Number 8, how many protons are in an atom of magnesium? Number 9, which element has an atomic mass of 106.42? Number 10, what is the element with the symbol Ba? Number 11, name a letter never used in any element symbol. Again, there are 2 answers to number 11. I'll accept either one. The number 12, acetine belongs to which element group? Try your best and see how many you get. All right, so number 1 is silicon, number 2 is 12.01, number 3 is noble gas, or number 4, I found gold, but of course, there can be multiple answers. Number 5 is hydrogen, number 6 is ruthenium, number 7 is francium, number 8 is 12, number 9 is palladium, number 10 is barium, number 11 can be either J or Q, and number 12 is halogen. So water is very important when discussing biochemistry because life on Earth essentially revolves around water. It is very important. Living cells are 70% to 95% water, and water covers about 75% of the Earth. Water's properties result from its structure and molecular interactions, so its polarity and hydrogen bonding. So cohesion is that the molecules of a substance are attracted to another molecule of the same substance. So water, this is done through hydrogen bonds. So water is attracted to water, and this allows the water to have a bit more of a structure. And adhesion is water molecules attraction for other molecules. And we have surface tension, which is due to the hydrogen bonds, and cohesion, adhesion, all that. It's a measure of how difficult it is to stretch or break the surface of a liquid water has a greater surface tension than most liquids. And we have the moderation of temperature by water. Water moderates air temperature by absorbing heat from warmer air and releasing the stored heat from cooler air. Water has a high specific heat, meaning that it has the ability to resist temperature changes when it absorbs or releases heat. The result is that water can absorb heat from the sunlight and release it and keep temperature change within a range life can exist in. Because water has a high specific heat, it's not going to get too hot and burn everything and get too cold, meaning that it is able to keep your internal environment at a constant, like make sure nothing gets too high or too low, which is very good. So water is the solvent of life. The polarity of the water molecule is responsible for water's ability to dissolve essentially everything and gives it the name the solvent of life. So when talking about this, solvent is the dissolving agent of the solution. Okay, sorry about that. So solvent is a dissolving agent of the solution, which is meaning it is the larger quantity. Then we have solute, which is the substance dissolved in the solution, which is the smaller quantity. So an aqueous solution is just a fancy term for something that is being dissolved in water. We have hydrophilic, which is translates to water-loving, and hydrophobic, which is water-fearing. Nonpolar molecules aren't water-soluble, so for example, oil isn't water-soluble. The rule for what is water-soluble is like dissolves like. Water only dissolves polar molecules because it itself is polar. So that's why when you pour oil in water, it's not going to dissolve because it's non-polar. This is very important for life because that means that wherever water goes, it is able to take along valuable chemicals, minerals, and nutrients. So part 3, macromolecules. A macromolecule is basically a molecule with a large amount of atoms. This word is usually used when describing polymers, which are molecules that are made up of repeating monomers. All organic monomers have carbon, usually with hydrogen, oxygen, and nitrogen. So how are monomers linked or joined together? They are linked through a chemical reaction known as a polymerization reaction. The polymerization reaction is occurring when monomers are covalently linked, producing a removal of a water molecule for each covalent linkage. So there are 4 classes of organic molecules. So we have carbohydrates and monosaccharides, lipids, and we have glycerols, fatty acids, nucleic acids, we have nucleotides, and proteins, amino acids. So carbohydrates serve as fuel and building materials, so energy and structure. There are 4 types of carbohydrates named by the number of sugar molecules they contain. Simple saccharides are 1 or 2 sugar molecules, so monosaccharides, think single sugar, then disaccharides, which are 2 saccharides joined together with a covalent bond. We have longer chain saccharides, and these are what you refer to as polymers. Not all carbohydrates are polymers. The monosaccharides are the monomers, and then polymers are the polysaccharides and the oligosaccharides. So the important one is polysaccharides, which are complex carbohydrates with linear chains of sugars that function as either energy storage or building structures. Carbohydrates are the most common source of energy for the human body. Carbohydrates are very good for energy, but if a person eats more than needed, the extra is changed into fat. To the right, you can see the structure of the monomer glucose. The proteins. Proteins are long-chain molecules built from small units known as amino acids, or biochemical compounds consisting of 1 or more polypeptides folded. So here the amino acid is the monomer, while the polymer is the polypeptide, and then the macromolecule is the protein. So there are 20 standard amino acids, and sequence of an amino acid in a polypeptide comes from the DNA sequence of a gene. So proteins are essential to all cells. Many proteins are enzymes that catalyze biochemical reactions and are vital to metabolism. We will expand further on this. However, when you eat something, the enzymes, which are proteins, are hard at work making sure all the food is digested. There are many different proteins are also used for cell signaling, immune responses, and cell division, as well as much more. They are very important to your cell. Next are lipids. These are the only macromolecules that are not polymers. So we have 4 different types or classes of lipids. So the first are the fats, which are constructed from 2 small molecules known as glycerols and fatty acids. So we have saturated fats and unsaturated fats. Saturated fats are made from saturated fatty acids and are solid at room temperature. Most animal fats are saturated. We have unsaturated fats, which are made from unsaturated acids and are liquids at room temperature. Next, we have phospholipids, and they are very essential for cell membrane due to their structure that is very unique. They have a very unique structure that plays a big role in the cell membrane. So you have waxes, which are soft, and plastics. At room temperature, plants use waxes to help prevent water loss. Humans have wax in their ears to help protect their eardrums. Lastly, we have steroids, which include cholesterol and chlorophyll. Our body uses cholesterol to make their hormones testosterone and estrogen, and chlorophyll is used by plants to absorb light for photosynthesis. Lastly, we have nucleic acid. Nucleic acids are large molecules where genetic information is stored. There are 2 types of nucleic acids, deoxyribonucleic acid or DNA and ribonucleic acid or RNA. So the nucleic acids are made of nucleotides. So in this situation, the nucleotide is the monomer and the nucleic acid is the polymer. A nucleotide is made up of a nitrogenous base, a sugar with 5 carbon atoms, and a phosphate group. The nucleic acids allow organisms to transfer genetic information from one generation to the next. When a cell divides, its DNA is copied and passed from one cell generation to the next generation. So on the right, you can kind of see the big differences between DNA and RNA, the biggest being that DNA is double-stranded and RNA is single-stranded. And that DNA contains genetic information, while RNA kind of helps that genetic information be expressed within a cell. Okay, so let's do a quick check on macromolecules. Number 1, which of the following monomers does not form polymers? A, carbohydrates, B, proteins, C, lipids, and D, nucleic acids. Number 2, what is not a difference between RNA and DNA? So, which one is false, you could say? A, they have different functions. B, RNA is single-stranded while DNA is double-stranded. C, they are made from different nucleotides and sugars. And D, RNA is not made naturally by the body while DNA is. Alright, so the answer is C and D. So lipids do not form polymers, and both RNA and DNA are made naturally by the body. Okay, so chemical reactions and energy. Okay, so there are 4 types of chemical reactions. First, we have a synthesis reaction, which is a reaction in which 2 or more substances combine to form a single new substance. Then we have a decomposition reaction, which is the complete opposite, is which a compound, meaning 2, breaks down into 2 or more simpler substances. Next, we have a single replacement reaction, which sounds complicated. It's basically a reaction in which one element replaces a similar element in a compound. And you'll see what that means in a sec. And then a double replacement basically means when 2 compounds switch partners. On the right, you can kind of see what happens in the equation. So for single replacement, we start out with A, B, and C, and then we end up with B, C, and A because the element placed the other elements in the compound. So C and A switched places. Then we have A, B, and B and C, D, meaning that both of them just switched partners. So the element A joined the element D, while the element B joined the element C. So the law of thermodynamics. So the most important law is the law of conservation of energy. Energy that cannot be created nor destroyed. It can only be transferred from one form into another. Okay, so exothermic versus endothermic. Endothermic reaction is a reaction that takes place when energy is absorbed from the surrounding in the form of heat. Exothermic reaction is when energy is released from the system into the surroundings. If the reaction is negative, then it is exothermic as heat is lost, while a positive reaction is endothermic as he enters. He gains heat, gains energy. Heat is another word for energy in science. That is very important. So when talking about heat is lost or heat is gained, it also means energy, because a type of energy is thermal energy. Endothermic reaction is supplied with heat and is basically the opposite of exothermic. So one example is like cooking. So like cooking an egg, there must be heat added or absorbed from the environment to cook the egg or any other food item. And an exothermic reaction occurs as heat leaves an area and the temperature drops. If a person's hand is cold to the touch, heat is leaving the warm body and being absorbed into the cooler hand. It's important to remember in any reaction, energy is conserved in chemical reaction, meaning that the total energy of the system is the same before and after a reaction. Going back to the law of conservation of energy, energy is not gained or lost, it just transfers between different forms. So as you can see in the diagram, heat is entering and leaving the reaction. So in endothermic, heat enters a reaction, so energy enters the reaction as energy is needed, while exothermic energy or heat is leaving the reaction. All right, so enzymes and catalysts, we briefly talked about this with proteins, so let's get into a bit more of a complex understanding. Substances in plants and animals that speed biochemical reactions are called enzymes. Enzymes are able to build up or break down other molecules. The molecules they act on are called substrates, and then enzymes are one class of catalysts, which catalyst is a general term for chemicals that speed up a chemical reaction without undergoing any change themselves. They are very important for biochemistry because without enzymes, processes in our body that take seconds will take hours and days. So it's very important because there's a lot going on in our body. Of course, since enzymes are proteins, they are composed of amino acids. Enzymes are very specific. This means that each type of enzyme only reacts with a specific type of substance that it was made for. So how do they work? Enzymes have a special pocket on their surface called an active site. Molecules they're supposed to react with fit neatly into that pocket. The reaction takes place between the enzyme and the substance at the active site. After the reaction is complete, the new molecule or substance is released by the enzyme. So what affects the functionality of an enzyme? Because of how specific enzymes are, a lot can go wrong and affect it. Temperature, at some point the temperature will become so high that the enzyme will denature and stop working. This is why it is very important and very dangerous when you get a fever, because if it goes too high, your enzymes might stop working. Extreme pH higher or low will typically slow the reaction or stop the reaction altogether. Concentration, of course, a higher concentration of substrate or enzyme can increase the reaction rate. And then inhibitors. Inhibitors are molecules that are especially made to stop the activity of enzymes. That's important to note. Okay, so here isn't linked to an informational song on enzyme catalyst because this is a lot. Okay, this exercise determine whether the example is exothermic or endothermic. For these questions, I want you to look at the number, determine whether it's negative, positive, what's the value, and see whether it's endothermic and exothermic based on what we just went over. All right, so the first one is exothermic, second is exothermic, third is endothermic, fourth is exothermic, fifth is endothermic, sixth is neither, as nothing is happening. There's no transfer in energy as it's at 0. I mean, no work is happening. So that's something to note. 7 is exothermic and 8 is endothermic. So this is a review. Exothermic is when the product is negative, while endothermic when it is positive, as negative means that heat is being lost, while endothermic or positive means that heat is being gained. That's kind of what that means. Okay, so part 5, biological reactions. Cellular respiration. Cellular respiration is a process by which organisms use oxygen to break down food molecules to get chemical energy for cell functions. It's often called aerobic respiration because the process requires oxygen. In the absence of oxygen, cells can get energy by breaking down food through the process of fermentation or anaerobic respiration. This process is an example of exothermic reaction as energy is released by the breakdown of organic compounds such as glucose into the energy source ATP. So glucose is typically used when learning about cellular respiration. However, it is important to note that this process does occur with any other macromolecule or monomer, I should say, but it's just glucose is often used when studying it. So you start with glucose and oxygen when you breathe in, and then you let out the chemical energy, which is typically ATP, and then you let out carbon dioxide as a waste, which plants take in, as well as water. So that, again, the energy released is captured in molecules of adenosine triphosphate or ATP, and then used to fuel other cellular processes. So as you can see, that is the process. You don't really need to know all the nitty-gritty, but in the second step, that's when carbon dioxide is created, and in the third step, that's when the ATP and the water is formed. Okay, so photosynthesis. Photosynthesis is the process by which green plants use sunlight to make their own food. Photosynthesis is necessary for life on Earth. Without there would be no green plants. Without green plants, there would be no animals. So photosynthesis requires a little bit more. They require sunlight, chlorophyll, water, and carbon dioxide gas. Chlorophyll is a substance in all green plants, especially in leaves. Plants take in water from soil and carbon dioxide from the air. So again, photosynthesis is very important because of the oxygen it produces, because we need that in order to breathe and survive. And the chemical reaction is endothermic as the energy from the sun is needed to power the reaction. That's what gets it going. So essentially, all our food comes from the sun. Just think about this process is the exact opposite. Okay, well, we'll get into that later, but it's the exact opposite of cellular respiration. As you can see, sunlight comes into the plant, and so does carbon dioxide, and then oxygen, as well as the glucose or the sugar leaves the plant, or it's produced by the plant, and then water comes in through the roots. So the difference between the two, both processes are the exact opposites. So when it comes to a chemical reaction, it's important to note that the left is the reactants and the right is the products. So the left is what's going into the equation, and the right is what's coming out. So when it comes to photosynthesis, what's going into the reaction is actually the products of cellular respiration. And then what are the products of photosynthesis is what's being used in cellular respiration. So in that way, biochemistry is very crazy because it's just a circle of life. Photosynthesis produces something for us, and then produces something for them, and they produce something for us. Other important things, again, photosynthesis is a process where plants take light energy from the sun and change it into food, and then cellular respiration is where the food is being broken down into usable energy. Okay, so here's some additional resources and the Works Cited page. So thank you for listening to my lesson. If you have any questions, do not hesitate to reach out. Thank you.